This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast,
I'm going to go
please
through
visit
aspects of
opentuition.com.
the 2013 question 4, P5 question, Landau lamps. To get the best from this presentation, you ought to download the question and perhaps the answer from the ACCA site. So if you haven't done that, then it's suggested that you pause this playback and go and do that now, and then have a good read of the question and then come back to this presentation. Before reading the question, what you should have done is to have gone down to the requirements. You must always read these first because they forewarn you what the question is going to be about. So immediately we see it is to do with some transfer pricing, more transfer pricing here, and then there's something to do with divisional structure, and there's part C. Then when you go to the question, you can read it with far more insight as to maybe what's going to be important. Let's concentrate on requirement A, and it uses the word evaluate. Whenever you see the word evaluate, you should always be thinking that there's some sort of judgment involved. You should expect that there may be some good aspects and some bad aspects about what the transfer price. We also see illustrative calculations as appropriate. That's always slightly unpleasant. You are very much, it's left up to you to decide what calculations may be appropriate. But something is certain, you have to do some sort of calculations if you're going to get anywhere near the 10 marks. That's wanting us to talk about the transfer pricing, evaluate the transfer pricings of Landau. And I think what you have to do is to have, if you're going to make some judgment on that, is you have to have in your own mind what makes for a good transfer price. And generally speaking, what you want to see in a transfer price is the following. First of all, it has to be perceived as being fair. There are two parties involved in transfer pricing questions, the transferor and the transferee. If the transfer price is wrong, then you're giving one of these parties a very easy time, the other one's a very difficult time, and that's really unpleasant for these people. And remember that quite often what happens is that you evaluate performance. You evaluate a person's performance based on maybe their divisional profit, and divisional profits change as you change the transfer price. And if the transfer price is unfair, people get very resentful indeed. Ideally, it should go for goal congruence. It should manipulate or encourage the participants to adopt activities which are good for the group, good for them and good for the group, that they volunteer essentially to do what's good for the group. You want little intervention. Sometimes this is called autonomy. So once you set a transfer price, you want to go away and leave the participants up to their own decision making rather than continually interfering. And finally, I think it's quite nice if you give both participants profit. You set a transfer price that all divisions can get a profit. On one level, it doesn't matter where the profits are divided, the group profit is going to be the same. Where this is particularly important is motivation. Managers are motivated by getting profit, whereas they might not be motivated by having to stick to a cost budget or behave as a cost center. And ultimately, high motivation should give rise to higher profits. So we would rather not see one of these divisions make a loss, if at all possible. So let's go and see what the question then said about this. So we've got a very classic situation. We have got the two divisions, one components here and one assembly. The head office is there allegedly providing some sort of support. The components division makes housing components and electrical components. I do find the use of the word housing here as potentially slightly confusing, particularly if you're not someone who has English as a first language. You begin to think, are they making components to build houses as well as lamps? What they mean by the housing components is a kind of container in which the lamp is built. The kind of structure, the lampshade, the stand in which the lamp is actually carried, and so on. And then there are the electrical components themselves, presumably things like switches and bulb holders. The finance director has currently overloaded with work, so he's put work onto you, particularly with the transfer prices. And the current transfer price, the current transfer pricing policy is as follows. So market prices for electrical components. These are generic components for which there is a competitive external market. And generally speaking, there's a lot of strength to be had in setting a transfer price at a market price or close to a market price, because this is perceived as fair. If you weren't part of a group and were a division acting on your own, you would either have to sell at or buy at the market price. So this gives the participants at least a feeling that the transfer price is not being unfairly manipulated to distort performance. It's also, of course, quite good because it's quite good for performance measurement. Fairness is an essential part of decent performance measurement. What it might not be quite so good at in certain situations is goal congruence. Hopefully market price will give the components division a profit, but when that transfer price gets input into the assembly division, the profit becomes essentially a variable cost to the assembly division, and sometimes you can find some difficulties there. It should also give people the chance of profit, of course. If they're anyway decent at all, they should be able to sell at the market price. If they can't sell at the market price and make a profit, then maybe that division shouldn't exist at all, and maybe we should close it down and simply outsource the supply of these components. The housing components is based on total actual production costs to the components division. There's no external market. Now this will mean if you charge total actual production costs that there will be no profit. It means for making housing components, the component division is bound to break even on these items, and that is of course before any head office charges come landing on their desk. So this could be regarded as kind of non-fair and certainly rather non-motivating. The other problem is total actual production costs here. Actual is an interesting word in here because it means whatever the costs are, these are then transferred on to the assembly division. Therefore, where is the motivation to keep costs down? And essentially this actual here is very bad for goal congruence. Overall, the group will want to keep its costs down, but there's no motivational push at all for the components division to keep costs of making the housing components down. Any old cost is simply transferred out at the transfer price, and of course the poor old assembly division gets lumbered with what might be excessively high costs. Currently, the components division produces only for the assembly division to meet overall demand without the use of external suppliers. If the components division were to sell its electrical components externally, then additional costs of 269 would arise for transport, marketing and bad debts. Now what this is essentially saying is that the market price that is being charged or being used as a transfer price for electrical components might be unduly favourable to the component manufacturer. If it were truly on its own, standing on its own feet, it would have to incur this 269. So almost it's getting that for almost free profit. And maybe what we should be thinking of is market price minus 269,000 as reasonable transfer pricing. That would be called the adjusted market price. Or maybe to encourage the assembly division to at least buy from the components division, we could argue market price minus, let's say, 50% of the 269,000, so that we give both of the divisions, if you like, a slice of the benefit for buying and selling internally rather than going externally. Both of those would be kind of viable. What sort of calculations would we perhaps think of? And we could think about certainly calculations here showing how the transfer price for the electrical components could be adjusted, maybe brought down by 269 from its current amount. And I think we'd also have to do some sort of calculation. How could we give some profit perhaps to these housing components? It can't be a market price because these are there's no external market for these. We don't have a market price, but maybe some sort of cost plus might work. So we take the cost of the housing components and we add on a bit of markup there, a certain percentage markup there to give some profit. I would also be questioning here whether we should be using the actual production costs of the components division. Maybe what we should be using instead of actual is the standard. If you base transfer out prices on standard production costs, then it gives people great incentive to stick to the standards. If production costs over the standards, they will only get a transfer out price based on those standard prices, and if you like, the adverse cost variance will stay with the producer rather than being passed on to the assembly division here. So we've probably got enough for some calculations here. We've made decent comments on fairness, goal congruence, ability to motivate and so on, because of course the assembly division doesn't make any sort of profit. We have criticized the use of actual production costs, and we can do some calculations on new transfer prices to illustrate what we are suggesting. So what would my alternative calculations look like? And we've said that the electrical sales here, 1557, in a way those are at market price, but we're thinking that this 269, or maybe half of it, or at least you put the argument up, the 269 that will be saved because of internal transfer maybe shouldn't be in there. So what I'll do for sales here is, let's say we change that. So instead of 1557, we'll have 1557 minus 269. So 1557 going to give us 1288. We're not changing anything to do with any of the costs at all, I don't think. So we're going to be having exactly the same as before. We're going to have 804 in here, or I don't need to put the totals in even. So 7706, 804, 6902. So that'll be there. I'll work out the housing transfer price in a moment. In the production costs here, I'm going to keep those at 370 and 1302, so 2761 as before, and we're going to have the 461 again as before. So we have a new transfer price here for the electrical components. What about the housing components? These, if you remember, were the components where there was no profit, and we can see that there's no profit within that because the selling price is 8204, and if you take 6902 and 1302, you come up to the 8204. So they're just transferring out at full actual cost. What we want to do is not to transfer out at actual cost or a transfer price based on actual cost, but one on standard cost. And also we'd like to give them a bit of a profit as well. So perhaps what we should be thinking of in here is of that 8204, we see here that there's an adverse variance of 575 last year, specifically to do with housing components production there. If that 575 wasn't there, I'm going to have 8204, 7629. So 7629 should have been the standard cost, and instead of transferring out at actual or standard, let's give them a bit of a markup, and that's going to be arbitrary, but let's just see what the effect is. The model answer, I think, gives 30%. Let's say we're going to give them a 25% markup, so times 1.25, so 7629 times 1.25 is going to give us about 9536. So 9536 would be in there. So that is a 25% markup on what the standard costs would have been. This will give the components division 1288 plus 9536, sales of 10824. We take all of these costs off, so minus 7706 minus 1672 minus 461 is going to give us 985 of a profit. So we turn this nasty loss here, non-motivating loss, into a profit of 985. What's the effect going to be on the assembly division? Well, instead of transferring in at 1557 and 8204 here, we're going to be essentially transferring in at 1288 and 9536. So we've got there 10824. This will be the same, 15794. All of these costs down here are going to be the same as well. whoops, wrong place. We're going to have in here 1268 and 2046. So the profit that we're going to be getting in here is sales 15794 minus the new transferring costs minus 10824 minus the old fixed costs and head office allocated costs minus 1268 minus 2046. Going to be 1656. You'll see that this plus that is still going to give that. Apart from motivational effects, fiddling around with transfer prices will not alter the group profits. But now we have a transfer pricing system which gives both of the divisions some profit there and there, so it's much fairer. It's perhaps fairer in the sales revenue it's giving to the components division for the electrical. It's taken into account the 269 which is saved. And very importantly, it is giving now the components division some profit, 25% markup, on what it's manufacturing in the housing, and also giving it some incentive to be efficient in manufacturing the housing division, giving it some incentive to be efficient in manufacturing the housing components, because it's giving it incentive by basing the transfer price on standard costs rather than total actual costs. Part B. Advise the Finance Director on the impact of changing the transfer pricing policy for housing components as suggested by the Finance Director, and comment on your results, illustrating your answer with calculations as appropriate. So let's just go back and see what this proposed change in transfer pricing was going to be. First, the transfer pricing policy for housing components would change to use variable cost of the components. Finance Director wants to know the impact of the change in transfer pricing policy and the existing results of the two divisions and the company. No changes proposed in the transfer price of the electrical components. Well, the calculations are very simple. Basically, what it means is at the moment, the 8204 which we have here is a sum of the cost of sales there and the fixed production costs. So those two kind of that one and that one add up. All that will happen is, if we don't have this 1302 in here, is that the transfer price will simply be 6902. The variable cost. And all that will happen is that instead of making a loss of 78 in here, because the transfer price, the revenue is down by 1302, is going to have 78 plus 1302 as a loss in there. So that is going to be 1380 as a loss. And we're going to increase the profits here because the 8204 that was in there is going to go down to 6902. So when we get down to the bottom here, we're going to have 2719 plus 1380. So we're increasing these people's losses here, big one, plus 1302. We're increasing the losses in the component division, and it's simply transferring that extra cost, that extra saving, if you like, through to the assembly division. And again, you'll see 4021 less 1380, so 4021 minus 1380 is going to give us exactly the same group profits. As I said, fiddling about with transfer prices, apart from motivational and certain decision making, isn't going to affect the group profit. So what we're doing is favouring the assembly division by this move, and as a relative disadvantage to the components division making even bigger losses. The good thing about using variable costs is it allows the assembly division to see from the group's point of view what the true marginal cost of production is. However, we have to think of it really from the components division. If we go up to the beginning of the question and see what's in here, the company has traditionally relied on the high quality of its designs to drive demands for its products. It's suggesting here that the real source of competitive advantage lies with the components division, and that the assembly division, this is a very, very simple process, there is no competitive advantage here. So in the assembly division, that is very ordinary. In the components division, this is basically a core activity, you might call it. And here what we're doing is we are kind of penalizing the components division, condemning it to make huge losses, and we are in a way feather bedding, showing great favoritism to the assembly division, which is not a very skilled part of the organization. And we seem to have got things back to front, really. If anything, we should allow the components division to make good profits if it's the real mainspring of the business, and have the rather mundane, ordinary assembly division, okay, make profits, but maybe not make fantastic profits. That might be a more sensible way to organize it. Part C. Evaluate the impact of the change in proposed divisional structure on the profit in the divisions and the company as directed by the FD. So we have to be looking at 3 or perhaps 4 different effects now, because when we go up and see what the finance director's suggestion was up here, second, as can be seen from the divisional performance below, 2 divisions are currently treated as profit centres. The finance director is considering splitting the components division into 2 further separate divisions, electrical components division and a housing components division. So what we're going to end up with now is the housing division, the electrical components division, here housing components division, electrical components division, we have got the assembly division, and we have the company itself. And the question, if I remind you, said impact of the change divisional structure on the profit of the divisions and the company as directed by the FD. If the board agrees to this proposal, then the housing components division will be treated as a cost centre only, charging its total production cost to the assembly division. The electrical components assembly divisions will remain as profit centres. The finance director needs to understand the impact of the proposed new divisional structure on performance assessment and the company as a whole. She's asked that to keep discussion of the new structure simple, we use existing transfer prices if we do any illustrative calculations. Stated that she would reallocate head office costs to the 2 new components divisions in proportion to the total cost of sales. So before we get on to any calculations here, let's think about the division here into the housing components division and the electrical components division. Now this has got some considerable advantages to it. It allows 2 different managers to be appointed as heads of these divisions. They will be concentrating more specifically on the performance of their very specific roles and what they're actually doing there. At the moment we have somebody who is head of the components division who has got in a way 2 streams of revenue, two causes of costs, housing components and electrical components, and there may be greater clarity in splitting those. What about changing the housing components division or making it a cost centre? Now generally speaking, one could put up an argument that if you're a profit centre, then there is more fun being motivated to make better profits than there is trying to make your costs lower. So I think in here there would be a certain losing out in maybe motivation. Whoever becomes the head of the housing components division will be looking at costs. However, if you are a cost centre here, then of course you live or die really by costs. You're given cost budgets. You are judged on how well you meet cost targets and cost budgets and so on. There is kind of no rescue package coming from the sales side, coming from the revenue side. And if we remember down here, it was, of course, the adverse variance here, which did occur in the housing components production. And if they are finding it difficult maybe to stick to their production costs, maybe they're concentrating too much in revenue, and especially in this deal where they're guaranteed to sell anything they make to the assembly division, and they can pass on all costs because the transfer price is based on costs, then it might focus their attention a little bit on costs if they were a cost centre, and it might help to get rid of this 575,000 of the adverse variance. So if you are in charge of a profit centre, you concentrate on profits. If you're in charge of a cost centre, you concentrate on costs. And there may be occasions where that is worthwhile. So far as the electrical division is concerned, I don't think maybe a huge amount is going to change there. I still think you can make well, I think we can give it a bit of a profit because it's going to become 1557 on its own, because we're not changing the transfer prices. There's an 804 cost in there, and there's a 370 cost in there. So before the head office costs are taken into account, 1557 minus 804 minus 370, we have a profit there of 383. And all we have to do is to split this cost in some way, and the finance director said that that was going to be done on the basis of costs. So to keep it simple, let's split it on this kind of basis here to see what the costs would be. So if we multiply by 804 over 7706, so 461 times 804 divided by 7706, you could do it taking into account the non-production costs as well. It's going to give about 48 of costs in there. So 383 minus 48 is giving us 335. So it is going to be a profit centre. We're giving it some profits for motivation and so on. The assembly division, there's really no difference at all. At the moment, the assembly division is taking in goods from the housing goods at the actual cost, and it's still essentially going to be doing that. So there's going to be no difference to this profit at all, and there is going to be no difference whatsoever to the profit of the group. Again, that's not altered by fiddling around with transfer pricing or changing the divisional structure. It's just changing where within the division the profits and the costs are actually going to be incurred. So I think the main part of this is really saying that our electrical component division is now a successful profit centre. It is motivated. We are getting people in the housing division to concentrate more on costs if they are a cost centre. The disadvantage is that we may find that they are slightly demotivated, because, as I said, being a cost centre isn't as much fun as being a profit centre.